And I'm going to try and cover three or four things at the most before we hand over to Diane. And based on my experience, I've discovered this sort of thing only shows up to most Christians in the theological debate of Arminianism versus Calvinism. Now, I do a lot with debating, but debating scientists who sadly don't even know what their presuppositions are, because one scientist I debated said, we go by facts, not by faith. So this issue is a vital one there. And then we've got homeschoolers who are saying this is God's model, or you've got Christians who say, no, God set up the state to control education. So how would you decide what these people are basing their thoughts on? Because most of them assume they are dealing with facts. Okay, bit of a tongue-in-cheek evidence, because the title, Joe's right. I mentioned that in a debate and nobody got it. It was an argument about Calvinism versus Arminianism, etc. You know, John Calvin and Arminius, and all of the conflict that's come from God's sovereignty, man's choice, etc. And as part of this debate, I said, well, personally, I choose to be a Calvinist. Silence. Nobody laughed. And I thought, am I the only one who gets the joke here? So I went on to say, and you've been chosen to be Armenian. Now that brought some really negative reaction there. They started to get the point by that time. But what is the role of faith and fact in all of this? I debated one of the professors at Cambridge. He's the professor of geology, and he and I were having a real tit for tat, bang and bash on this subject of creation, evolution, etc. And he'd make one point, I'd make another to knock his out of the sky. He'd come back with three more points. And in the end, I simply said, no, listen, here is the real difference between you and I. You believe that facts matter. But if you're going to be a scientist, do you realize there's three things you have to believe? You're attacking me because you say, I just believe, and belief has no part in science. I said, you're ignorant of the real history of science. There's at least three things every scientist has to believe in order to do science. No, there's not. Yes, there is. Let me list them. First of all, you have to believe the universe is real. Secondly, you have to believe that you're real and you're rational. And thirdly, you have to believe that for every real and rational question, there's a real and rational answer. Now, he stopped. He looked. He'd never thought of that before. You see, I can take you to India and introduce you to a guy sitting on the ground going, because his presupposition is the universe is not real. This is a fake reality. We need to escape to reality, to nirvana, etc., the absence of thought, get away from thinking. Now, the Western mindset has basically got a Christian worldview that man is made in the image of God and God is rational. Therefore, man in the image of God is rational. Now, he'd never even thought of that in his atheistic geological mindset, that there has to be certain things you believe in order to do science. And I said, therefore, if the universe is real because God made it discrete, he made it separate from himself, it has an existence, even though it's a dependent existence, it's still real. And for every rational question, there's a real and rational answer. He looked at me again and I said, look, come to me to India again and ask that man a question. You'll find that he's quite happy, and some of his followers are quite happy, wearing long yellow robes, shaving their head, and going around saying, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Right? What is the sound? You can ask that question for 1,000,000 years because it has no rational answer. And that's the purpose, to stop you reaching a conclusion. You see, there are both rational questions and there are irrational questions. And if you believe there's irrational questions, an irrational universe, and irrational answers, you will never do science. And then I made the killer point. And can I encourage those who want to debate evolutionists, listen to what they're not saying. That man assumed he was dealing with facts. In reality, he was dealing with facts that had been seen through a pair of Christian glasses by God-given presuppositions, not from God's point of view, they're presuppositions from our point of view. We were made in God's image, therefore we're rational. The universe is real because God made it discrete, and the universe has laws because God is a lawgiver and he stamped his nature in creation. And as Joe pointed out quite rightly, even though he didn't mention these verses in Romans chapter 1, it says that God has stamped his nature on creation, and it can be seen. Can be seen by everybody. Therefore, no one has any excuse. The evidence alone is sufficient to condemn you and will be used on Judgment Day to judge that geology professor if he hasn't become a Christian. You see, it's not just blind faith, it's fact-based faith, and faith that is used to actually see the facts. Now, you come to India and you'll find irrational answers are quite acceptable. In fact, I'll go one step further. We are looking at a time in the West when people are moving from fact-based history to fantasy-based history. How do I know that? We had a group at Jurassic Ark just recently, and half the kids were not interested at all in the scientific evidence. And the teacher made an interesting comment. He apologized for the kids having about a 3-minute time span. And he said, it's because they're playing with their YouTube clips and there's no more than a couple of, 30 seconds to 3 minutes. And that's as far as they're interested, but they're not interested in the facts. They just want to be entertained. And he said, I've noticed that they no longer have any interest in real history, with dates and times and places and 1066, here's what happened, etc. All they're interested in is the fantasy stories of Aboriginals, where you can change it from tribe to tribe, and it doesn't really matter what the facts are because they're not factual in the first place. Or if they are, it's such a long time since anyone bothered to check what the fact information is that the fantasies don't matter. Okay, now this scientist was assuming that he was totally fact-based. And as some of you have known me for a long time, have noticed that I've gone to point out quite a lot of things that are actually dependent on Christian presuppositions. Let me show you. See my shark's tooth? Well, it's not my shark's tooth, really. It's a 3D cast. Isn't that fantastic? A student did that for us. He was learning how to make a 3D caster and a print machine. And he's gotten better and better. Like, here's the original fossil I gave him to run some tests on and to copy, to put in the machine. There's his first attempt, and he hadn't learned to color, and it's a little bit crooked. And there's his second attempt. Now, you and I live in a world where the average scientist says creation is just a belief. No, creation is anything that can't happen by itself. And this didn't happen by itself. I even encouraged the student. I paid for the cost of the fiberglass and the plastic and the color and all that to encourage them, otherwise known as bribery. But you see, because he took his time equals work and effort equals money, I wanted to encourage him. But that copy did not happen by itself any more than that original happened by itself. Or whether it was just the DNA from mum and dad in the original that produced this copy, or the original DNA, which shows all the evidence of not being able to happen by itself. So when you have a look at the issue here, we have Christian presuppositions. No, we weren't there at the time of creation. We can assume all we like about Genesis chapter 1, but if you want to ask the question Joe asked, what would the evidence be that God created? It certainly has a factual answer. The thing can't happen by itself. But the scientist I was debating at Cambridge, he assumed that evolution was the general framework. Everything had to be explained in evolution and nothing else was acceptable. Hence, we get back to our shark's tooth. Now, I don't know if you've ever read Nicholas Steno, but he's got a book yay thick on fossil sharks and fossil things like that, just trying to prove that the Middle Ages assumption by the Catholic, that they were mentally Christian up to there only. After that, they used all the pagan presuppositions, the old Roman, the old Greek presuppositions that fossils were found in the earth because they were tricks played by the gods to deceive us. So Nicholas Steno, God has made the world. God doesn't deceive us. If it looks like a shark's tooth, it probably is a shark's tooth. And his book, it's worth reading, is yay thick because he had to get into people's heads that if it looks like a seashell, it's probably a seashell. It looks like a plant, it's probably a plant. And yet you and I take that and we run with it and we don't even know it's a Christian supposition. In the beginning, God. Yes, we assume and then we argue logically based on that. But logic, where do you get your logic from? Are you accepting Christian logic or non-Christian logic? In fact, let me criticize again, many of the creationists don't like my nice little finds. Did you see that? I mean, I'd noticed this rock a couple of years ago, but I hadn't stopped to see what it was like close up. Do you see all the layers? Now, some of you have watched our strata machine experiments and know that we aggravate the dickens out of even many of the creationists as well as the evolutionists. In fact, we had someone from the Department of Mines there one day, and he made the comment that his friends know about what we're doing. One of them was there today, and he was so angry at our strata machine. Why? Because it doesn't do what Nicholas Steno, this famous and accurate for his work on fossils, his next set led us astray because he assumed in his set of suppositions that the bottom layer got there first and rocks were laid from the bottom to the top. Now have a look at the creationist fraternity. Have a look at the evolutionist fraternity. They just assume that is true and they run with it. And yet every bit of work since then, because when you look at the strata, those strata were formed from one side and they went to the other. In fact, there's 60 feet, 20 meters or so of those strata we had time to stop recently on the way to Gayndah, get out and collect specimens. And whether they were tiny or whether they were yay thick or whether they were the whole 20 meters, it was layer upon layer upon layer, which had all poured in from one side and gone to the other side. Layers are formed sideways, not from the bottom to the top. Now, whether you're dealing with a volcanic layer of ash, whether you're dealing with sediment or things like that, you will find that our basic supposition borrowed from Steno is wrong. Oh, I know I've aggregated some of you again, but I need to keep doing this until you listen. I'm sort of like that pastor who was employed by a church, and after the third week, a dour old elder came and said, "But pastor, you've preached the same sermon 3 times. When are we going to get something new?" And the pastor said, when you listen the first time, when you listen the second time, when you start to show evidence you've listened the third time, then I'll change to a new sermon. And the same is true when it comes to these Nicholas Steno suppositions. We need to change our logic. We need to change our argument. Why? Well, the first man to point out the reason why was John Ray, England. Now, you mightn't have heard much of John Ray, particularly our American viewers. Can I encourage you Americans, just because you threw the tea in the harbour and you threw the rest of British history and thinking in the harbour, it's time you went and dredged some up, particularly names like John Ray, because here's one of the guys who helped with the classification system, but he also read Nicholas Steno. The bottom layer got there first. Therefore, it's the oldest. Therefore, the creatures that lived in it before that, they were before the creatures in the next layer. Therefore, you get the idea that geologic column is a history. Therefore, you get Huxley and you get Lyell and you get Darwin saying the bottom layer must have formed yay long before. In fact, John Ray didn't have any of that in his head. He made one simple comment. If we argue the bottom layer got there first, then the world is much older than the Bible allows. Did you catch that? Because in the 300 to 400 years since Steno's work has become popularized, what you'll find is even the creationists have struggled with this problem and they can't see where the presupposition is. The presupposition is the one that John Ray pointed out. If Steno is correct, then the world is too old for the Bible to be true. Remember the point I made? When you are doing a debate, and I've successfully debated many people, including a professor of geology at Cambridge, you have to listen to what they're not saying. He was not saying that he was Um, he understood where his logic came from. He understood where his he said he was dealing with the facts. No, he wasn't. He was dealing with the facts that were seen through anti-Christian glasses. Anti-Christian? Yes, it wasn't just non-Christian. It was anti-Christian because I finished off that debate by saying, now let me read to you Charles Lyell, upon which you build all your interpretation of dating and all of that. And Charles Darwin builds his whole evolutionary model on. If you want to blame anybody, Darwin's a victim more than an initiator. Lyell is the founder when he said, my aim is to get rid of Moses. And that's where geology's got to. That's where any Christian geology that says the bottom layer got there first, sooner or later will get to abandoning a biblical position more or less. Now, at that point, I'd won the debate because we'd established that this debate was not about his fact versus my 10 facts versus his 20 facts or whatever. It was about, where do you get the glasses from? What are you assuming that you're not telling us? The evidence is that he was using presuppositions. I know you think those are mutually exclusive terms. They're not. Now, when you look at Calvinism versus Arminianism, don't try and fit God into an Arminian box. He's too big. Don't try and squash him into a Calvinist box because he's outside both of those. I love the old Charlie Brown joke that I used before. God chose you to be Armenian. There's a lot of truth in some of these statements that are sarcastically said, and even the reverse of what might be true in order to get you to think. Now, when you have a look at our strata and all of these things, I'm going to just finish off with one more thing. I've just checked my notes to make sure I haven't gone too far here, because I want to hand over to Diane soon with some practical examples. I was visiting Tasmania. Craig's Museum is in Tasmania. Our new Creation Discovery Centre is in Queensland. Make sure you come and visit either Craig's or ours or Joe's, where you'll see the evidence, because God says he will judge us on the basis of evidence. But God also says without faith, it's impossible to please him. Right? So you've got both of those things that are true at exactly the same time. Mightn't be the way you'd run things, but you're not God. So don't try and put God in your box. He doesn't fit. He's outside. He's too big and too glorious to fit in any one of our boxes. And in fact, it shows up most in an education system which trains us to think exactly like my professor of geology I was debating had been a victim of. And he thought he was independent in his ability to think. Okay, what am I talking about? Tasmania, Port Arthur. You know, our famous penal colony. One of the reasons why one of our prime minister banned gun ownership almost holus bolus, because of the massacre that occurred at Port Arthur. But you go there and you see one of the most savage regimes that's ever existed in prison world. Oh, yes, they had a chaplain. If they got to get out of that system, they knew what God said was right, because plastered all over the walls were the 10 Commandments. Now, the 10 Commandments don't start by saying, I am the creator, the British Empire. I am the creator, and I give you these rules, the British Empire. No, they are the 10 Commandments given by God who created. So at least you can give the British credit for saying, here's why you're in jail, because God says thou shalt not murder. Now, I'm not going to justify what was done at Port Arthur or anything the British might have thought they were doing in God's favour. Remember, Jesus was warning the disciples, there will come a time when these people will say they're murdering you to give God something to bless God. Now, be careful with that sort of logic. But here in Port Arthur, they had a lovely chapel. Yes, you were all in individual booths and you could only look ahead, nothing to the side. You couldn't watch your iPhone or anything like that. Your face was forced to go to the front where the chaplain was. And there's a little note over the side about who designed this system, why they designed it. Number one, you all had the same looking box. Number two, you could all see only the same view. Number three, you couldn't ask any questions or challenge the authority at all. It was punishable by law. Okay, who designed the system? Jeremy Bentham. Now, why did he do it? Because we must have conformity of behavior in order to run the state. So God gives us a law, but we enforce it in a particular way to guarantee uniformity of people's thinking about everything. So they're not entitled to think for themselves. They must think our way. They become much more controllable. Okay. Next step. Have a look at our Australian education system. I remember when I went to school, we all sat at big long desks and we all had exactly the same thing in front of us, an inkwell, a pen, and we all faced exactly the same way, and we weren't allowed to look anywhere else, designed by Jeremy Bentham. So that the state system of education, despite the fact that you might remember, you older people, having Bible readings, they had them in the Port Arthur as well. But it was designed to submit them to uniformity so that everybody came out the other end thinking, the state tells me the truth. I don't need to think. The authorities have thought, and I'll do as they tell me. And you see this in, we have the right to tell you when to send your kids to school. We have the right to tell you, and away it goes. And most of us have grown up thinking that's right. No, it's Jeremy Bentham. But Jeremy Bentham didn't believe in God. Jeremy Bentham believed in the state. Jeremy Bentham didn't even believe in natural law. Jeremy Bentham believed in the state-imposed law. Now, his presupposition, man is autonomous. Man is able to do this, provided it's me, and provided we're in charge. And we need to actually, mums and dads in homeschooling, have you wondered why you've had such trouble sometimes? Have you wondered why there are whole states that forbid you to homeschool? Well, there's your key, because it upsets their ability to regard themselves as autonomous givers of right and wrong. Jeremy Bentham. But Jeremy Bentham's based on really atheism, naturalism in a real sense, without God-given law, and it becomes the same sort of thing that produced my professor of geology I debated. So can I just finish this segment by encouraging you, as Diane comes, as Craig shares, have a look at what's not being told to you in the school textbooks. Have a look at what's not being told to you by the education philosophy. Have a look at what's not being told to you in this yes-no vote in Australia. Like, aren't they telling you the Aborigines have been here for 60,000 years? And there are many Christians who say, well, it doesn't matter how long they've been here. Oh, yes, it does. One of your presuppositions is that it doesn't matter how old the world is. Sorry, you're wrong. You need to find out what the biblical view is and work from that biblical view. That's your presupposition. But then say, here is the evidence of it. So don't treat these things as separate. They are totally interconnected. And wherever there's one, there'll always be another. And the person you're debating or the unbeliever will always have hidden presuppositions. Do your best to ferret them out. Joe, back to you.